On this edition of the Correspondents, U.S. Vice President Mike Pence issues a stark warning to North Korea as Pyongyang threatens to preemptively strike the U.S. and South Korea. Will a deadly attack on a police bus in the heart of Paris affect the outcome of the French presidential election? 11 candidates running to replace President Francois Hollande. And Turkey's opposition parties scramble as President Recep Tayyip Erdogan moves one step closer to consolidating new presidential powers. And welcome to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Milar Sega in Washington. We begin with the escalating war of words in the Korean Peninsula. North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un says he's ready to launch a, quote, super mighty preemptive strike against the United States and South Korea as tensions mount over the nuclear threat posed by Pyongyang. U.S. Vice President Mike Pence aboard the U.S. warship at a Japanese naval base Wednesday called North Korea the most dangerous and urgent threat to the region and issued this blunt warning to North Korea's leaders.
And those who would challenge our resolve or our readiness should know we will defeat any attack and meet any use of conventional or nuclear weapons with an overwhelming and effective American response.
And for more on the increasingly tense dialogue between the U.S. and North Korea, we are joined here in Washington by VOA White House Bureau Chief and Senior Correspondent Steve Herman. Welcome back, Steve. Along with international broadcaster Steve Miller, the host of VOA's Asia in a Minute. I thank you both for joining us. Steve Herman, you just heard those fighting words from Vice President Pence. One almost gets a sense of two high school tough guys facing off against each other, daring the other one to make the first move. What's your take on this back and forth?
Well, we've had back and forth like this to varying degrees for many decades, and the Korean Peninsula is always tense because an armistice was signed. There has never been a peace treaty after the conclusion of hostilities in 1953, and there's a lot of firepower on both sides of the DMZ, and we have to be very careful and very cautious. But I think it's very important to look at the history of the language from both sides. Okay. The United States, the Vice President now obviously reassuring allies because of contradictory remarks that President Trump had both before and after he took office. And I think it was very important for the Vice President to be there, meet with these people, go to the DMZ and say these words. Now, the rhetoric coming from the other side up out of Pyongyang, we've heard this for many, many years. And super mighty, maybe they don't remember some of the cartoons in America, how that comes off very comedic. But I think sometimes we have to brush off what they're saying, and sometimes we should take it seriously. And what's very important with North Korea rhetoric is not only to look at the words, but who's saying them. And stuff that's coming in editorials or from diplomats or the foreign ministry, I wouldn't give that too much credence. But when we see some kind of order being issued by the military command, that is much more important to pay attention to, and we're not at that stage yet.
Steve Miller, to Steve Herman's point about this super mighty preemptive strike statement, Pyongyang usually responds to any kind of threat with the usual typical bluster, right? But at what point do we actually take these threats seriously?
Well, like Steve said, when you have remarks from the military side making declarative statements on where they're moving troops, or if they're casting out their Navy to patrol along the northern limit line on the western coast, then things have a more serious nature. When it's just propaganda going back and forth, that's really what it is. Right.
And Steve, to your point, given the somewhat misleading kinds of claims and sort of contradictory statements that have been coming out of the White House regarding particularly this powerful armada that is headed towards the Korean Peninsula, which, as it turns out, was actually going in the other direction. I wonder how much of the statements that we're hearing out of the White House now are really meant more to reassure our allies of U.S. commitment.
Oh, there's no doubt about that, that this is absolutely critical. And I don't know if we've had a real satisfactory explanation out of the White House or the Pentagon about what was misdirection or miscommunication. Regardless, it caused confusion. There was criticism in Seoul that, okay, we criticize the North Koreans for all of these exaggerated and misleading statements, and here was the same thing happening from the United States, and that hurt America's credibility. No, absolutely no doubt about it. And we now know that the strike force is headed towards the Korean Peninsula. By all indications, it will be there on the 25th, which is a key anniversary date, Military Foundation Day in North Korea. And there's some expectation that the North Koreans will want to demonstrate their might around that day.
Not to plug Voice of America, but we actually had the facts on the USS Vincent, correct, didn't we?
Carla Babb, yes, our Pentagon correspondent, was quite insistent when these reports first came out that her information is that they were headed in the direction of Australia. But I even had sources telling me that no, this wasn't the case. So, and that was the case with every other reporter here in Seoul and in Japan as well was getting this information.
Steve Miller, South Korea seems to have been eclipsed by this sort of war of words that's going on between the United States and North Korea. What is the reaction there in Seoul?
You have to keep in mind that South Korea is about 2 weeks away from a presidential election. So they're going through their presidential debates, and this is one of the many hot topics of how to deal with North Korea. And as we mentioned last week, Ahn Cheol-soo, who is the second most popular candidate at this time, has been kind of changing his stance over time, trying to garner some of that more conservative base, which is usually taking a much harder line against North Korea, a much more vigorous kinds of statements coming from him. We've seen in this past week his popularity drop about 7% in the latest Korea Gallup poll. So there's about a 10-point spread between the front leader.
So it is having an impact on the South Korean elections.
Oh, yeah, and there's even reports in South Korean media that there's some propaganda from North Korea trying to influence the election as well.
Steve Herman, I'm wondering, has China weighed in yet on what's developing there?
Yeah, the Chinese have been out with their typical public messages about urging restraint. We know behind the scenes that there's tremendous pressure being put by Beijing on Pyongyang. President Trump has spoken of that, and at a news conference on Thursday, he made a mysterious comment that there had been developments in the last 3 or 4 hours, as he put it, of China apparently taking some action against North Korea. We have no idea really what that is. The Chinese are denying that they've put bombers on alert. The Russians are denying that they've massed troops on the border. A lot of confusion out there right now, but we definitely know as a result of that Xi Jinping, Donald Trump summit at Mar-a-Lago a couple weeks back, that the Chinese are definitely moving in a much, being more assertive. And one piece of information that I think is a little bit beyond just speculation is a threat by the Chinese to cut off crude oil supplies if North Korea goes ahead with the 6th nuclear test.
What are you hearing, Steve Miller, from your sources in South Korea? Is this creating a lot of confusion there?
Again, those who live in Seoul, live in South Korea, live with the threat of North Korea every single day. So again, they are looking at this as more of part of the typical cycle of events. So after the foundation, the Korean Army Foundation Day coming up next week, they expect some kind of event that will de-escalate the situation, and things will again proceed as they normally do.
Right. I'm running out of time, Steve Herman, but do we yet know if the White House actually has a coherent policy on North Korea?
I think that what we've been hearing, that all options are on the table. That's basically the policy. Is the policy, but that's been the policy for decades, and I wouldn't read too much into that. And, you know, as a lot of analysts would say on Korea, there are no good options.
You guys are absolutely right. Thank you so much, Steve Herman and Steve Miller. We're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, we head to France, where a far-right candidate shares a lead in what's become an increasingly tight race for president. And now, recent events there could make the race even tighter. This is The Correspondents on Voice of America.
This is BizBeat.
You can live or die by the sword or make money by the sword. That is, if you're John Lundemo, who's been crafting Odin blade swords for 30 years.
I was always breaking the steel swords. I was breaking them all the time. You know, halfway through a sword fight and your sword breaks, it's annoying. So I started making them.
Inspired by history, Lundemo's sword designs combine ancient Eastern and Western cultures with a mix of Hollywood and his own ideas, of course. And yes, there's a market for them. Ryan Whitlinger is the owner of Cult of Athena.
People with a general historical interest, martial arts practitioners, people who practice both Asian martial arts and European Western martial arts.
It's hard work hammering at the anvil, dipping the blade into the forge, and then grinding and sanding into a shiny slicing weapon.
The cool factor is way up there.
That cool comes at a price. A handcrafted Odin blade sword will cost you $1,500 or more. For VOA's BizBeat, I'm Philip Alexio.
VOA, telling America's story for more than 70 years.
The voice speaking from America and the war.
VOA exports America's most powerful product, freedom of speech.
Close the waters.
In parts of the world, information is scarce and oppression real. VOA, sharing a voice that says, we report the truth.
And welcome back to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Millar Sega in Washington. Islamic State militants have claimed responsibility for a terrorist attack by a gunman that killed a police officer in Paris Thursday. The attack came just days before the start of a French presidential elections, where far-right candidate Marine Le Pen is leading in some polls. Now, Le Pen has called for the closing of all mosques in France and has dominated the campaign with their anti-immigration, anti-EU platform, which has basically excited supporters and alarmed many of her opponents. Le Pen faced a raucous crowd in the city of Marseille as she delivered a rousing campaign speech to thousands of flag-waving supporters at Le Dôme Hall. This was Le Pen's final rally before the first round of France's presidential election. Earlier, just 3 kilometers to the south, anti-Le Pen protesters marched through the streets of the city center, some throwing rocks at police officers in riot gear. Police quickly brought the rally under control and blocked demonstrators from reaching Le Pen's rally. So, is the French election a sign of things to come in a changing Europe? For some perspective, we are joined by VOA European correspondent Luis Ramirez in our London studio. Hello, Luis. And right here in Washington by VOA Macedonian service reporter Jane Bojagiewski, who's been looking at the big demographic shifts going on in Europe. Luis, I'm going to start with you. Let's start with the Thursday attack at the Champs-Élysées, arguably one of the world's most famous avenues. That's where a gunman wielding a Kalashnikov killed 1 police officer and seriously injured 2 others. Now, is there any word on how this attack might impact the weekend elections in France?
Well, you know, the common belief among analysts is that it most certainly could have an effect on how voters decide. We're talking about an election in France that's unlike any other in recent history. Up to 1/3 of voters still undecided. Very volatile word coming from the polls. One moment you have Marine Le Pen racing far ahead. And then this last week, just before the elections, we see the far left candidate surging. That's Mr. Mélenchon. So there's no telling what will happen with 1/3 undecided, just so close to the poll.
So is this, Luis, is this attack helping one candidate over another? What are you sensing?
Well, having been in France just over the past week and talking to voters, I can tell you that one big issue, although not many people are choosing to talk about it, is the issue of terrorism. The mainstream media and certainly the candidates themselves, with the exception of Marine Le Pen, have concentrated largely on the issues of the economy, on corruption. One gets a sense in France that the overriding theme, what is common to all voters on both the left and the right, is anger and disgust with the establishment. So that opens the door for a new candidate bringing new ideas.
Jane, let's get you into this. I want to discuss with you the mood in Europe, because first of all, you had Brexit, and then just very recently we had you on the show for this, a very close call in Netherlands, and now we've got France. Now, in each case, we seem to be getting some kind of momentum that's being fueled by a very nationalist, kind of anti-European kind of fervor. Explain to me the mood as we head into this weekend election.
European perspective, let me put you in a couple of sentences. People are tired of globalism. When you have the politicians who has the attitude that the people are having the values around him, it's appealing to a lot of people. That was the thing in Brexit. That was the thing in the last U.S. Elections. A lot of things is going on in Europe, and the outcome of the political elections in France can have a political tsunami in eastern part of the Europe. Because let me tell you that the governments in the region where I'm coming from, they're putting a lot of efforts about the European integration, about if the dream of the United Europe is dead, that can create a lot of uncertainty.
So you're saying what's going on in Europe is reflective of things that are going on also in Eastern Europe?
Definitely, because the whole region is going on the European Union idea. And if the populists are winning, for example, far-right Marine Le Pen, when she barks out rhetoric arguments, when she mentions Islam, integration, disinformation.
People get fired up, right?
People get fired. She worships also the U.S. president. She worships the Russian president. She wants to cut the ties of the European Union and eventually Brexit.
Luis, while all this is going on, I'm wondering, is there a reason why Francois Hollande is not running for a second term?
A very big reason, and that is his approval ratings. 4% in just a couple of months heading into these elections. So really, it would have been political suicide for him and the socialists if he had run again. What that horrible approval rating reflects is dissatisfaction with the way his government has handled two major issues. Number one, the economy in France, still struggling to recover from the downturn of 2008-2009. We're talking about more than 10% unemployment rate, jobs leaving France, well, in large numbers. I just came from the Rust Belt in northeastern France, which is a stronghold of Marine Le Pen. That's exactly the reason. They said Hollande came here, promised to save these plants, and then within months they were closed. So he's been booed when he goes to these places, while Le Pen gains support. And then, of course, there's the issue of security and terrorism. The second issue after the economy is the migrant crisis, when voters across Europe, not just France, saw more than 1 million people pouring into Europe from Muslim countries. That sent alarm through many, and of course, many drew a connection between that influx and a spike in terrorist incidents.
And Yanni, there's a great deal of interest as well in other parts of the world. We're sort of thinking about what happened here in the United States. Can you sort of see a Putin factor here? Is Russia involved in choosing or wanting a certain candidate to win?
Let me tell you about the Putin factor. Not surprisingly, the two of the major candidates, Fillon and Le Pen, has long been cultivating a close relationship with Vladimir Putin. Le Pen was in Moscow last Friday. Fillon can be seen at the social gatherings of Kremlin lately. The both of the both candidates' foreign policy issues, it seems like have been dictated from Moscow. Let me give you two examples. Marine Le Pen openly says that there is nothing wrong with annexation of Crimea of Russia. From the other hand, Fillon says that actually French army should support Bashar al-Assad forces and should support Iran. So far, the both of the candidates will not held accountable for what they are saying, for what the
So we're going to have to watch whether or not Russia has any influence in the outcome of this. But Luis, I'm kind of running out of time, but much like Brexit, there seems to be an element there in France that wants to leave the European Union. Is that a factor as well in this election?
Very much so. That's a debate certainly that's been fueled by Marine Le Pen, who unequivocally has said France should leave the European Union. That's a cornerstone of her platform. And so people, as Jana was mentioning, who are fed up with globalism, who feel like it has not benefited them personally, they've lost their jobs, they've not taken part in any of the benefits that free trade has brought, certainly see it very attractive to do what the British did and leave the European Union.
And of course, there's also a very important election going on there fairly soon, and I know you'll be covering that for us. I wish I had more time, Janne. I wish I had more time to speak with you, Luis, but we are out of time for this segment. We'll have more after this when we come back. Turkey's ruling party is notching a controversial win at the ballot box, giving Turkey's president even more power. That's coming up next. But first, a reminder, we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, questions, and comments on our Facebook page. The address is VOA The Correspondents. We'll be right back.
From science and technology, here's what's new.
How about your very own 41mm cameraman? It's called the Solo Shot 3, and it's a robotic camera that tracks your every move up close and personal, or from more than half a kilometer away. After attaching the 1.4-ounce water and shockproof Solo Shot tag to your arm, the Solo Shot camera will pan, tilt, and zoom with your every movement by tracking the tag. The base features a built-in touchscreen, Wi-Fi capability, and Solo Shot Edit, which automatically gathers and edits recorded video highlights. The base's battery lasts 3.5 hours with a motorized pan that can turn 180 degrees in 1 second. The Optic 65 camera shoots in 1080p and 4K resolution and has a 65 times optical zoom range. There's a less expensive version too, the Optic 25, which has a lesser zoom range capability and no 4K option. Look for the Solo Shot 3 to hit the market sometime in June. For VOA's What's New, I'm Todd Grosshans.
How do you see the world?
I see countries in turmoil.
I see our planet changing.
I see people at peace.
No matter how you see the world, you'll get an unbiased and uncensored view of it on Voice of America. On television, radio, online, and mobile. In more than 40 languages all day, every day. Millions of people tune us in.
How do I see the world? On Voice of America.
And welcome back to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Millar Sega in Washington. Turkey's ruling party celebrated a controversial victory this week after narrowly winning a countrywide referendum that vastly expands Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's executive authority. Turkish opposition parties and international monitors are challenging the results, claiming more than 2 million votes may have been manipulated. VOA's Zlatitsa Hoke has our report.
Voters were asked to endorse an 18-article reform package proposed by the ruling Justice and Development Party that would replace the current system of parliamentary democracy with a powerful executive presidency. But the Turkish opposition says it will contest the vote, which it claims was fraudulent. Erdogan called on the opposition to accept defeat, and he expressed confidence that nothing can stop him now. The constitutional amendments also end the official neutrality of the president and allow him to lead a political party. He will have the power to dissolve parliament and declare a state of emergency, as well as appoint judges to the High Court and Constitutional Court. Erdogan has also said he would reinstate the death penalty, which was abolished in Turkey in 2004.
And of course, Turkey's electoral authority rejected all appeals this week to annul that referendum. But the country's main opposition party, the CHP, says it will continue to challenge those results. To help us understand now how this referendum changes the political dynamic in Ankara, we are joined once again from our London studio by VOA European correspondent Luis Ramirez, and right here in Washington by international broadcaster Alparslan Esmer with VOA's Turkish service. I thank you both for joining us. Alp, for our viewers, maybe perhaps you can explain this to us. How does the Turkish referendum actually change the dynamics of the Turkish political system?
As a matter of fact, the president wants to change the system into presidential, which has been going on.
We're getting out of the parliamentary system towards a more
presidential system. And it was actually, for the past few years, the change has already been occurring. And practically, the prime minister's powers was somehow in a way reduced. And what happened was, in a de facto system, the president decided to bring out this referendum to just get the approval of the people in a way to legitimize his current standing. And He was already convening the cabinet. He was already just coming up with executive orders. So what happened was this constitutional referendum, these 18-point constitutional referendum points will simply expand his powers in a way that, yes, definitely the prime minister's post is going to be abolished. He's going to be running the country with executive orders. He's going to be convening the parliament. He's going to be declaring elections. Besides, the current amendments can give him certain loopholes that he can...
He's already, in fact, delivered some executive orders regarding capital punishment, for one thing, right?
As a matter of fact, he brought this topic as soon as the election results were announced. So he spoke to his public, he addressed his public, and he said he's going to bring it back because he's always pushing the agenda in a way because the public wants it. And his supporters are definitely behind this idea of capital punishment.
Let's get Luis into this conversation. Luis, President Trump this week, as you know, called President Erdogan to congratulate him on the referendum victory. That seems to be actually in sharp contrast to the reaction we're hearing from European leaders who've been a lot less congratulatory. What can you tell us about that?
Well, to start with, they didn't congratulate him at all. Not a single EU leader did. And expressed very much disapproval, concern about this vote, calling for an investigation into irregularities. You know, to begin with, they didn't think that this vote should have taken place. And so that's a very, very different response than received from President Trump.
Mm-hmm. And Alp, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, I guess OSCE, has some doubts about the validity of this election. In so many words, essentially saying the referendum fell short of international standards. What exactly does that mean?
Well, actually, I've been watching OSCE reports about Turkish elections in the previous... I mean, I was there in the previous election.
You were there in the last election in 2015.
And yes, this is the first time they're actually bringing forward about these election irregularities. What are they? They're coming up. I mean, the preliminary report says the referendum took place in an unlevel playing field, and two sides of the campaign did not have any equal opportunities. Voters were not provided with impartial information about the reforms. Civil society was not able to take part in it. The media coverage is one-sided. And the other thing, actually, when the Higher Election Board decided to count the votes, the envelopes without official stamps, that actually raised some suspicions. And the OSCE also brought this matter along, and these are most of the issues they're concentrating about, and definitely the opposition decided to challenge the...
Luis, has EU weighed in on some of these voting irregularities that we're hearing about from the independent election committees?
Very much so. Germany and France, for one, have expressed concerns about those irregularities. And while they're not calling for a recount, they're saying an investigation most definitely needs to happen. Once the results of that investigation are known, if it warrants a recount or perhaps maybe holding a new vote all over again, that's a separate question to be answered later. But as I said, in their heart, they really just wouldn't even want to see this referendum to take place to begin with.
Right.
One of the reasons, the big issue with them is that what they see is a gradual spiraling of democratic values in Turkey, the amassing of powers by the executive, and what a European Commission spokeswoman called crossing the reddest of all red lines would be a reinstating of the death penalty.
It's so fascinating, but in 5 seconds, can you tell us, could this affect Turkey's bid to join the EU?
Absolutely. That's an easy one. The EU has made it clear that that would kill, so to speak, any bid to join the EU.
Again, my thanks to Luis Ramirez and Alparslan Esmer, and to, of course, all our correspondents today. That is our show. But we'll be back again next week for another edition of the Correspondents. In the meantime, stay up to date with all the latest news at voanews.com. You can also catch all of our shows there. Just click on the Watch tab. We're also on Facebook and YouTube at VOA The Correspondents. I'm Bill Arcega. We thank you for watching. But for now, so long from Washington.
Around the clock, the Voice of America provides you with comprehensive African and world news. Wake up with Daybreak Africa. Then in the evening, listen to Africa News Tonight. And on weekends, it's Nightline Africa. In between, you'll hear VOA newscasts at the top of each hour. VOA, bringing the world to you.